Let's return to the budget. Now, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has talked a big game about fairness, but can he deliver? Joining me now to discuss this is the Center for Independent Studies' Simon Cowen, who's written a brilliant op-ed about the budget, and he's going to be keeping a very close eye on the numbers. Simon, thanks for joining us here tonight. Now, first of all, you have written a fascinating piece here, and you say that this budget has got a number of problems, not the least of which is that they have to deliver everything on the one night and that they can't actually deliver economic reform. Is that correct?
Well, so it's a structural problem with the way that we do budgets in Australia. So, and this is, as you know, as a New Yorker yourself, this is not the norm across Western countries where there's so much of a focus from a policy perspective on one day and one night. And that, to some extent, is cutting across the ability of the government to deliver on substantive reforms. When you add into that the difficulties in our political climate, the way that the Senate has been operating for a number of years now, there's a real difficulty in delivering anything of substance, anything that cannot be explained in a simple diagram on budget night.
And Simon, one of the things you talk about is the way that the government has been intervening in some very regulated, very unionized sectors of the economy, but not others, such as aged care. Do they now create this expectation that they're going to intervene everywhere to increase wages, improve conditions, and this sort of thing? And does that not just set us up for more inflation and more deficits down the track?
So there's two very big problems with this. The first is that by intervening in selective industries, with the government basically promising and then underwriting wage increases for private businesses, by intervening in that way, they're creating expectations in other industries. So that's going to drive up wages potentially there as well. But there's a secondary problem, which is that we end up with the government underwriting the cost of all of these things and the fiscal implications of those decisions. So it's not so much the inflationary impact, it's one, government stepping outside of its role, intervening in the job market in a way that it shouldn't, and two, it's the cost of doing these sort of things. You know, we're only looking so far at a couple of sectors and the cost is enormous. Once you start getting into, say, teachers or even, you know, other sort of state government responsibilities like that, the price tag could be just enormous.
Well, Simon, I'm glad you said state responsibilities, because this occurs to me to be very much like what we see across the states and territories across this country. You have governments that decide that they're going to intervene, that they're going to raise wages for various public sector groups, but they're not building anything. They don't have anything to show for it, but they do have huge recurrent expenses on the books. How do we get out of what seems to me like a wage debt spiral on the federal side?
It's a big problem. We're seeing it in Victoria and Queensland in particular. The recently elected Labor state government in New South Wales is basically promising to remove all these wage caps, particularly around teachers, for example, with an inability to even cost how much that might actually set the budget back. So there certainly is a growing problem there. And it's also this decoupling of the idea that we should be getting productivity benefits for wage increases. Now, it's difficult, right, to measure productivity in the public sector. There's sort of additional components to it, but it can be done. But unfortunately, we keep seeing the government shying away from those sort of things. You know, in education, it's a good example. My colleagues have done some great work on this about how you could actually drive productivity enhancing reform in education and around wages. But when we just say, well, you know, the government can afford to pay for it, we don't actually have to pay for it in the short term anyway, why don't we just boost everyone's wages? It's exactly the wrong way to go about it.
And Simon, just very quickly, you know, let's put your economist hat on and let's take politics out of the equation. If they could do one thing, you know, a real budgetary reform in tomorrow night's budget, what would that be?
Well, so we've been on about this for a really long time. The simplest and most effective in the long term reform that they could do is that they could eliminate bracket creep by indexing the tax brackets. So right now, as we see, you know, inflation's running at 7%. Over time, everyone is paying more and more of their wages in tax thanks to bracket creep. With a stroke of the pen, Treasurer could eliminate that forever. That'd be a terrific reform. Unfortunately, governments like handing out tax refunds and they like handing out tax cuts, even if they're not real. So we won't see something like that, unfortunately.
No, Simon, and in fact, I suspect that tomorrow night when the budget is handed down, we're going to see an awful lot of wage inflation being exactly how they're planning to balance the budget. Simon Cowen from the Center for Independent Studies, thank you so much for joining me tonight.